When I was 17 years old, at the beginning of a sojourn that led me into Christian faith and the Catholic Church, I stayed at a monastery. It's a Trappist monastery in Virginia along the Shenandoah River. And the monks let me live with them and go through their lives with them. I prayed with them, I worked with them. But there was one thing that they didn't let me join them. The Sunday I was there, in the middle of the 2-week period, right after Mass, they had a meeting called Chapter. There they discussed the business of the monastery, their relationships with each other, their economic lives, their spiritual lives. And they said, we have some hard decisions to make today, and we think we'd be able to speak more freely if a visitor wasn't there. So I said, okay. I went to the library, opened a book, and started to read. And then I started weeping. I didn't exactly know why. And I didn't think about it too much after that. But I've started to reflect on that moment a bit more now. I think I could sense that something really important was happening while I was sitting there in the library. Something that is very deeply rooted in our tradition. Maybe something that the world desperately needs and that our tradition has to offer. A way of relating to each other, a way of doing business, a way of being a church. This tradition goes all the way back to the very beginning of the church, to those passages in the book of Acts when people are first gathering together knowingly as followers of Christ. And in both Acts 2 and 4, there are these passages where the followers of Jesus talk about themselves, or begin sharing their belongings. And this is a response in both cases to evidence of God's power and mercy. They see in both passages signs and wonders in one and wonders and signs in the other, and then immediately start sharing their property. They seem to sense that knowing God, seeing God, feeling God among each other has something to do with how they do their economy, how they manage their property, how they share with each other and take care of one another's needs. A few centuries later, as Christianity became the religion of empire, some of the most devoted, impassioned Christians felt the need to flee to the desert, first as hermits, then as small communities, then as monasteries. And there too, enlivened, fired up with the Spirit and with their faith, they began sharing property, supporting themselves with simple work, managing their resources together. This tradition carried on into the Middle Ages. And you see it in a particularly powerful way in the rule of St. Clare, the companion of St. Francis, as they're reviving the simplicity and the kind of original spirit of their Christian tradition and faith. As their communities start forming into orders, the Pope gives her a rule, right? And the rule doesn't actually include that chapter. It didn't occur to him, I guess, that women might need to govern themselves, or that they possibly could. And so she inserted this passage in the rule that not only institutes the chapter, that regular meeting to discuss the business of the community, but she reminds the sisters that the Lord often reveals what is best to the lesser among us. That if we don't include everybody in how we govern ourselves and how we order our business, we might be missing out on the Word of God. This also connects to a doctrine that was starting to insert itself in the earliest formulations of canon law. This idea that's so paradoxical in the midst of a world that doesn't reflect it, that ultimately all things are common to all people. In God's eyes, that's how things are. This is a doctrine that's often called the universal destination of goods. That we should find ways, even in the midst of a world where we have property, we have lines of whose is whose and what is what, that nevertheless we should act toward that vision of God in which we share all of these gifts, in which all of these things are God's and are all of creation's. This idea comes back in the early modern period, where popes, like so many others, are wrestling with the tumultuous rise of industrial capitalism. There's communism on one side, and then there's capitalism on the other. Abuse of workers, people toiling all day and all night, and then on the other hand, a kind of ideology of violent revolution. Between those, leaders of the church turned back to this tradition. They pointed toward an ambition, a world in which the means of production would be shared among us. They looked back to the tradition of the guilds in the medieval period, ways in which people organized their enterprises in their own ways, where the craftspeople would make decisions together about how their craft would be ordered. Universities like this one are descendants of that tradition, of self-governing masters working together to teach students. And this reclamation, this turn back in the late 19th century by popes started inspiring experiments, really creative ones. It urged Catholics to action, to start imagining what a fair distribution of property would look like in their communities. Sometimes this led to some dead ends. It led to some flirtations with fascism. But it also led to a really incredible outpouring of creativity and imagination, of faith in economic life. At the same time, all over the world, the tradition of cooperative enterprise started to formulate alongside the development of industrial capitalism. A different kind of economic model in which enterprises are owned and governed by the people who depend on them. Open membership, non-discrimination, democratic member control. Now, this is democracy that's not just once every 4 years or 2 years or 1 year, but democracy that you'd practice every day in your workplaces, in the stores that you go to. Rather than enterprises ruthlessly competing with each other, the vision was that they would cooperate, they would work together. That members participate not only through their voting, but through their investment. They're bought in, they have a sense of responsibility. And the enterprise works to educate the members and the broader community. This is a tradition, a practice, an art that Catholics have been kind of eerily good at. The first credit union in the United States of America was St. Mary's Bank, begun in the first decade of the 20th century, started out of a Catholic parish. And this began, in our country at least, the model of a kind of financial system in which people created their own finance, set their own rules, made sure that the proceeds of their loans and of their savings would stay in the community and would serve what they understood as the common good. And this is still a thriving sector of the economy, an alternative to a financial system that so many of us have come to recognize as deeply, deeply flawed. A system that, through all the downturns and crises of the system of Wall Street, has often been able to keep people afloat. In the 1950s, under the thumb of Franco, in the Basque region controlled by Spain, a Catholic priest named Jose Maria Arizmendi Arrieta started working with students at a technical college to build their own kind of economy, to support themselves despite the repression of the regime. Within a few decades, they had built a massive network of industrial cooperatives, now the largest system of worker cooperatives in the world. It employs over 70,000 worker owners who co-govern, co-manage high-tech industries, stores, financial institutions, research and development, everything that they need to operate and to succeed in the marketplace. And he saw this in a really interesting way. He saw this not just as an economic project that had an educational component. He actually saw this as a way of creating better people. An education project, perhaps first and foremost, that uses economy as its means. He understood, as many of us try not to, that our economic lives affect us every day. They form who we are, what kind of Christians we are. And so it matters how we do business. It matters and it shapes us. The examples are everywhere. I came across this passage from a 1944 editorial in America magazine, commenting on this community in Iowa that had built robust cooperative enterprises around its parish community. And the anonymous writer uses this really beautiful passage to describe the kind of education, forming of the whole person and of the community that cooperative enterprise is capable of doing. He, almost certainly a he, refers to this as social worship. What a beautiful thing to aspire to. And so, as a reporter, over the last few years, I've started looking at a new generation of cooperative enterprise. People after the last financial crisis, the latest one at least, who've turned to this tradition as a means of finding livelihoods that they can really believe in and that they believe can help serve the world. And one thing I notice among them is some of their organizations were getting funded in considerable ways by Catholic organizations. And I'd ask them, why is that? And they'd say, I have no idea. That they just came to us and said, can we support you? We like the work that you're doing. Many Catholics don't understand, don't know about this tradition either. It's kind of continuing to operate. It's continuing to take place as relief agencies spread cooperative models around the world. Yet, so often, this isn't part of our understanding of our own faith, that it has something to say, something to offer in how we approach our economic lives. Resources that we can help, that we can take with us as we become co-creators of the world. Pope Francis is someone who's become an incredibly eloquent articulator of this tradition. It's often not noticed, but if you look for it, you see these themes scattered throughout his speeches. And at one point in 2013, he told a story of his earliest encounter with the cooperative tradition, coming from his accountant father, the overworked accountant that he sometimes talks about. And his father mentioned offhand that cooperativism goes forward slowly. Doesn't have those great leaps and upheavals and creative destructions of capitalism. But it's sure. It's rooted in the people. It's rooted in their dignity as people made in the image of God and co-creators of the world with God. He turns to this tradition also in Laudato Si', his encyclical on the environment. He turns to cooperation as a way of reconfiguring our relationship with the economy and the planet. He also turns to it as a means of recalibrating our relationship with technology, not rejecting technology, saying that that's something we can't touch or handle, but embracing it with our human dignity, our faith, and our community at the center. This is something that I've been trying to do in organizing international networks of entrepreneurs and activists working to build an online economy where the online platforms, the Facebooks, the Ubers, are owned and governed by the people who depend on them more and more, who can have a say in what happens to all their personal data, who can help shape their emerging flexible workplaces. But Francis also warns that we can't think of ourselves as self-sufficient. We can't think that we have all the answers. At the same time, we must acknowledge the dignity that God has given us in creating us in God's image. Cooperative enterprise is a way of bringing that insight into our business, into our lives. And it's something that we can take out of the monasteries into the world.